It flourished for 3,000 years. It left behind arguably the most spectacular remains of the ancient world. It was a land ruled by elite leaders, pharaohs. They built immense tombs, many of which still stand today. Their mummified bodies and ornate death masks serve as a reminder of their riches. This is the familiar story of ancient Egypt. But the rich and powerful were a tiny percentage of the population. Recent discoveries, just a few steps from the Great Pyramid at Giza, reveal the secrets of the people who really built these breathtaking structures.
This is the first time that we know something about the common people, the ordinary Egyptians who built the pyramid.
Though less powerful, they too bequeathed a legacy, not of gold, but written on stone.
I think this kind of document is particularly interesting because it is a document of the ordinary people of ancient Egypt.
Egyptology is changing as it starts to turn its attention to the people who physically built the national monuments of ancient Egypt, the workers. The River Nile. At 4,132 miles, the Nile is the longest river in the world. It holds the key to the success of this ancient civilization. It flows northward through Africa, through Egypt, and finally into the Mediterranean Sea. In a dry climate, ancient Egypt could have remained as barren as the deserts that surround it. Instead, from the 4th millennium BC, Egypt flourished, and the water of the Nile was its lifeblood.
If there were no Nile, Egypt wouldn't exist because it's in a completely arid region. So the only source of prosperity in Egypt is the Nile.
Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt, no division between rich and poor, and no pyramids. Before Egyptian civilization developed, there was no social hierarchy. The population was made up of farmers who lived off what they could grow on the fertile land around the river.
The Nile would have shaped the worldview of the Egyptians in a manner that's almost incomprehensible to us. When the geography of southern Egypt is almost universally composed of a Nile, the cultivated strips on either side, and the desert rising on either side of that, it would have shaped your whole existence.
The river is fed from 1,400 miles south. Lake Tana in the highlands of Ethiopia is one of the sources of the River Nile. Every year, the rainy season comes between June and September. The continuous rainfall completely transforms the Nile as the rushing water scrapes away the surface of the land. The muddy current flowed downstream, north through Ethiopia and the Sudan, until it reached Egypt, about 1 month after the rains. As a result, each July, the level of the Nile rose in ancient Egypt, and there was an annual inundation of water for 4 months of the year.
The inundation of the Nile is what determines the success of agriculture. The floodplain of the Nile is a shape that we don't necessarily think of, in which the river is at a slightly higher level than the ground around it. So when the river is very full, the water floods onto the surrounding land. The river then retreats and leaves the land wet and usable for crops.
In the 4th millennium BC, just before the Egyptian civilization developed, the population of Egypt was entirely self-sufficient and based on farming. During the 4 months of the flood, the farmers who made up Egypt's population were unable to work. They could only wait for the floods to subside. It was only once the water subsided that the land was fertile. Then, early Egyptian farmers were able to produce a rich harvest. But some farmers were more successful than others. This led to a new phenomenon. For the first time, there were rich and there were poor. Surplus food was the trigger that led to the development of civilization.
The creation of inequality is the essential change that brings civilization. It's a very uncomfortable fact, but it seems to be a fact. And this must relate to the harnessing of large forces of people, perhaps initially through warfare, but ultimately it leads to the appropriation of surpluses by people to the center, to the king and to the elite, and away from the people as a whole.
With the evolution of a social hierarchy, the ruling classes were able to stop producing food for themselves and concentrate on other aspects of life.
People who are subordinate are then expected to produce their dues to the state. To the state means to an individual, to the king, and to the elite. And the king and elite must offer something back for this. They offer the driving ideas of the civilization, and maybe they offer things like security.
By offering protection to the people, the rich justified their elevated position in society. The priesthood's knowledge of the solar calendar meant they could predict the timing of the floods. This helped ancient Egypt's elite, and in particular the pharaoh, to be considered divine. It made the idea of building pyramids seem fitting. The largest of them all, the Great Pyramid on the outskirts of Cairo, is a gigantic structure made up of nearly 3 million stone blocks, each weighing at least 2.5 tons. It is the height of a 40-story building, and in ancient times, with its point covered in highly polished smooth limestone, would have been seen for miles around. But the Great Pyramid is not just a stone mountain. Inside is a complex of corridors and chambers. As you enter, you come to a narrow downward slope. Eventually, an upward slope appears, leading to the Grand Gallery. The corridor narrows even more as it moves towards the largest room in the pyramid. This is the king's chamber. An open sarcophagus has been placed inside, but the mummified body of the king for whom the pyramid was built has not been found. That king was Khufu, who reigned for a short time 4,600 years ago.
Egyptian civilization lasted well over 3,000 years, and during under half of that, kings were buried in pyramids. The 4 largest pyramids were all built within a century.
The study of ancient Egypt has concentrated on a brief period of pyramid construction. It has reflected the life and beliefs of the people of this remarkable civilization. There is no clearer evidence of these beliefs than in Cairo Museum. Here is a collection which speaks volumes about the rich in ancient Egypt. The mummies. The aim of mummification was eternal life. The Egyptians believed that in death, the spirit departed the body. While the spirit was in the next world, the body was not required. But they also believed in resurrection. The mummified body was preserved, ready to receive the resurrected spirit when it returned to the world. This belief in rebirth was connected to the annual flooding of the Nile. As the flood replenished the dry land, so the Egyptians believed that their human spirit could be restored after death. And they imagined that each year the resurrection would take place at the time of the flood. The gift of eternal life only applied to the elite, like Tutankhamun. And it was not just adults who were mummified. Even the unborn babies of the rich were preserved for immortality. These tiny coffins contain the mummified bodies of 2 baby girls, their umbilical cords still attached. If, as archaeologists believe, these are the children of Tutankhamun, it would explain why they were treated to such a grand burial. These incredible artifacts have told the well-known stories of life and death for the rich in ancient Egypt. But the lives of the majority of ancient Egyptians are yet to be uncovered.
Poorer people tend to be buried in simple pits in desert conditions. Now that can often lead to excellent preservation, but the history of Egyptology hasn't focused on that because it's always been an artifact-dominated science so far. But it's slowly changing, and we're beginning to reassess those less spectacular remains, because after all, they'll tell us about the vast majority of the population.
Now, as excavations in Egypt bring to light more evidence, there is increasing insight into the lives of working people. And because it is largely those people who physically built the monuments of ancient Egypt, it is possible that in discovering what life was like for the lower-class Egyptians, there may be a clue to how the vast monuments of Egypt, including the pyramids, were built. The civilization of ancient Egypt grew up around the River Nile, and many of its best-known monuments stand as a reminder of its leaders. But now Egyptologists are beginning to look not at the rich, but at the ordinary workers. Herodotus, the Greek historian, believed that pharaohs such as Khufu forced slaves to build the pyramids, and that theory has been passed down for nearly 2,500 years, from the Old Testament to Hollywood movies. But now, thanks to recent excavations around the pyramids, most Egyptologists think very differently. Here, a few hundred yards south of the Great Pyramid, are the ruins of what has come to be called the Workman's Village. Dr. Zahi Hawass is in charge of the excavation work and management of the pyramids.
This is the new tombs that we found. Very interesting tombs. You never see tombs like this only in Aswan at Qubbat al-Hawa. But this is a very interesting style because this is the first time that we know something about the common people, the ordinary Egyptians who built the pyramid. And this is why this discovery is amazing, because from each bone and from each stone, you can know something about the people.
The bones excavated at the Workman's Village are taken for analysis to the National Research Center in Cairo. The bodies of nearly 1,000 skeletons were found in the Workman's Village, and they revealed something about the people buried there. This bone is from a man's arm. A mark can be seen which shows that the bone was broken and treated. The swollen area is where the bone has healed. X-rays reveal that the bone has been fully reconnected using a splint. If the workmen in this village had been slaves, it is most unlikely that they would have been given such excellent medical care. Other bones support the theory that the workmen were not enslaved. Many skeletons of women and children were found, leading Egyptologists to conclude that the workmen could not have been slaves.
At
the workmen's village, there were also women and children. If the pyramids were constructed by slaves, only men would have been brought to the site. However, these men were living with their wives and children. Their lives were run independently. They were not slaves. The workmen were ordinary Egyptian people.
A further clue to the life that ancient Egyptian workers led can be found in the British Museum. Here, noted down on limestone, is the equivalent of a timesheet for day-to-day work. The tablet is a record of people who did not turn up for work, the date of the absence, and the reason for it.
It is inscribed on both sides and contains a record of about 40 names of workmen. I think this kind of document is particularly interesting because it is a document of the ordinary people of ancient Egypt. In the case of a worker called Seba, whose name is written here at the beginning of this line, he was off for one day because he was bitten by a scorpion. This is a kind of accident which could have happened even in the house in the village. The village where these workers lived was situated on the desert where scorpions are quite common. And in the case of the worker called Konsu, whose name is written here, he was absent firstly because he was ill for some days here, but then more interestingly, later on, we are told he is at his festival at this point. And this may be a family or personal celebration, such as a birthday, for example.
The workers are given leave of absence for many other reasons, varying from illness to bereavement to hangovers, evidence of freedom and independence.
It was a hierarchical society. There's no escape from the fact that there were people at various levels of society. But having said that, it was a much freer and equal society than certain others.
As free men, it seems likely that the workers who built the pyramids were paid. And there is evidence to support this in another new find, the tomb of a priest who lived and died in the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh who commissioned the Great Pyramid.
This is our most recent discovery, tomb that was found. This is the tomb of Kai, who was a priest, and this tomb dated to Dynasty 4, about 4,600 years ago.
At the entrance to the tomb is an inscription which seems to describe a contract between the pharaoh and the workers.
And he's telling us here that he paid them beer and bread. And he made them to make an oath and say that they are very happy.
This contract required the pharaoh to take full responsibility for providing clothing, food and shelter, while the workers contributed to the building of the pyramid. In ancient Egypt, during the floods, the construction of the pyramids was able to progress with speed. As the flooded Nile came close to the pyramids, even huge stones could be transported close to the construction site by boat. And as the farmers were unable to cultivate the land until the waters had subsided, there was a ready-made task force to assist the skilled artisans in the construction of the pyramids.
There were organised workers who were conscripted on what we call a corvée basis, which is they were required to work for the state for a certain number of time, and the workers would rotate throughout the year. And we know from text and graffiti on the pyramids that the different gangs had different names and so on. Now, obviously, in a situation where the Nile and its adjacent agricultural land is being flooded for several months of the year, that does free up a lot of the population, the working population, skilled labour, to work on state projects.
Though the building of national monuments was a year-round process, requiring highly skilled artisans, architects and engineers, for a few months each year, the labour force was boosted by the impossibility of farming, and for that period at least, the area surrounding the pyramids was almost a city in its own right.
People underestimate the type of organisation that would need to build such monuments. Not only do you need the labourers to cut the stone, transport the stone up the Nile and put the stone in place, so a lot of that's heavy labour. You also need skilled labour of the type used in, say, the chambers within the pyramids, or to finish off the casing blocks on the outer faces of the pyramids. But you also need this whole support staff. You need administration, security, you need bakers, brewers, people supplying food, people bringing water to the work site, equipment. You'd possibly have physicians there working on people's injuries. There's this whole mini community would have built up around the pyramid.
Slowly, a picture is emerging of the range of people who lived in ancient Egypt. But what is unknown, and a source of much debate, is why the pyramids were built and what they signified for the people who built them.
What the pyramids meant to ordinary people in antiquity is largely unknown, because we don't know how much the ideology of the elite in Egypt spread in the society as a whole. It's possible that everyone understood them in the same way, but we can't tell. But we can say that the pyramids appear to be a solar symbol, and to have something to do with the integration of the deceased king into the cosmic cycle, particularly of the night sky.
Then all of them, they unite. All of them. King, nobleman, official, workman, farmers, all of them together work to help the king to be a god.
If the pyramid builders were not slaves, why would such a huge number of people from all over the country and from all classes unite to build these huge structures? Perhaps it was because it was a well-paid seasonal job. But it was probably also because it was believed to be vital for the well-being of the people and the fertility of Egypt itself that the king became immortal. And in a way, he did. 5,000 years later, we're still drawn to his extraordinary tomb.
I think it's two things that bring every generation that comes into the world becomes fascinated with ancient Egypt. On one hand, you have the sheer incomprehensibility of the whole thing. The fact that they're building these pyramids and these massive monuments of stone that would be logistical nightmares to build now. Why are they building these? People want to know. Why are they cutting these tombs into the rocks and filling them with these wonderful gold objects? So that's one side of it. The other side that comes through when people learn a bit more about Egypt is simply how human the society is and how close to ours in a way, how little has changed sometimes.
It's now known that many of the real pyramid builders of ancient Egypt were ordinary farmers who could never themselves have had a grand burial. But while modern man is still so full of wonder at the sight of these remarkable structures, almost impossible to construct even today, these workers, too, will never be forgotten.
Rising from the parched sands of the desert, in the land of the pharaohs, are the earliest stone monuments ever constructed in ancient Egypt. Though shrouded in antiquity, they bear an eerie resemblance to another famous landmark built 2,000 years later.
If an advertiser wants to sell his goods and give them a high-class feeling and make them seem classic, or if a bank wants to seem reliable, or if a university wants to seem respectable, the ideal thing to show is a fluted column, preferably in rows. And the idea of the fluted column is really seen as at the basis of European civilization. And when we think of the basis of European civilization, we think of Greece, we think of Athens, and we think of the Parthenon with its rows of exquisite columns. Now, the Parthenon was built about 2,500 years ago, and these columns, which we're walking through now, were in fact built about 2,500 years earlier still. So they're twice as old as the Parthenon.
For one maverick historian, the resemblance is no coincidence. He thinks the ancient Greeks owe a debt to Africa for their cultural heritage. If he is right, the history of Western civilization will need to be rewritten. But is he?
Generations of school children have been taught of the glory that was Greece, of a white civilization that gave birth to cherished notions of democracy, philosophy, and science. But is it true? How much of that view is colored by racist attitudes of 19th century classical scholars? Today, a controversial new theory that the roots of Greek civilization lie in ancient Egypt has archaeologists in an uproar.
What forces converged in prehistory to inspire the genius of the ancient Greeks? Who forged the destiny of Western civilization? In his book, Black Athena, Martin Bernal of Cornell University contends that the seeds were sown in Africa and the Near East long before the arrival of the Greeks. His search for proof begins in Egypt, at the famed step pyramid at Saqqara, the first ever built. Surrounding the pyramid is a complex of buildings and courtyards believed to be a replica of the palace of King Zoser at nearby Memphis, then the capital of ancient Egypt.
We're now at Saqqara, which is a place of firsts. It was the place where the first pyramid was built. It was also the place where the first fluted columns were erected, and the place in general where stone architecture was used. So here we have the beginning not only of Egyptian civilization, but Western civilization as a whole. That from Egypt and from these beginnings in Egypt, we can see the development of Greece and Rome and modern European civilization as a whole.
17 centuries before the birth of Christ, Egypt ruled an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. Beyond, in the Aegean, was the island of Crete. Here, the empire of the legendary King Minos was reaching its zenith, while at Mycenae, the earliest roots of Greek civilization were taking hold. Connected by a vast network of trade routes, ships plied the seas laden with the treasures of the ancient world. Bernal believes that during this time, the Egyptians and the Phoenicians attacked the palaces of Crete and colonized the Aegean. Bernal's colleague at Cornell, John Coleman, is currently excavating the ancient city of Halif. An expert on the prehistory of Greece, he has found little to support the theory of an Egyptian invasion.
Personally, I don't believe that Greece ever was invaded by Egypt. There are very few documented instances of invasions of Greece, and we have no real evidence that in the form of, say, Egyptian language or Egyptian script, hieroglyphic, for instance, to suggest that, in fact, the Egyptians ever did come to Greece in any numbers.
Despite his critics, Bernal is intrigued by evidence that the Egyptians did control the Aegean. On the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, in the shadow of the Valley of the Kings, are the tombs of the nobles. Buried here are the most powerful men in Egypt next to the pharaoh.
We're now in the tomb of Reshmire, who was a high official of the great pharaoh Thutmosis III. And this tomb has the usual accompaniment of the affairs of everyday life, but it also has a great deal about Reshmire's duties as this high official, collecting taxes, administering within Egypt, but also supervising the foreign tribute that was given to the pharaoh. And you have a number of ranks. You have the Africans and you have the Syrians all giving their precious objects, and there you have the Minoans or Cretans dressed in their kilts and bringing objects that we know archaeologically were of Cretan manufacture. So there's no doubt about who these people were.
Professor Bernal sometimes speaks as if they were bringing tribute, as if Egypt somehow had control of the Aegean area. But in fact, recent studies have shown that they're gift bearers rather than indicating that they were in any way under the control of Egypt.
Now, whether the Greeks considered they were giving tribute or not is another question, but this is the way Reshmire and his pharaoh, Thutmosis III, interpreted it.
While Bernal clings to the notion of invasion and domination, he insists it is not critical to his theory.
My historical scheme doesn't rely on the idea of Egyptian or Phoenician invasions or settlements of Greece. What I argue is that Greece is permeated with Egyptian and Phoenician influence because of contact over a period of more than 2,000 years. Contact of all sorts, because the two countries are not, the two regions are not that far apart. To take an analogy, Greece is about as far from Egypt as Japan is from China, and we would be very surprised indeed if we found that Japan had no Chinese influence, but in fact it is full of Chinese influence. That's not to say that Japan is a mere reflection of China, but that you cannot hope to understand Japan unless you realize its Chinese roots in that way. Similarly, I think we should not do as the classicists have done and try to view Greece in isolation without seeing its outside roots.
The Greeks were undoubtedly influenced by the Egyptians in the case of architecture and also in sculpture. One obvious example is the large Ionic-style buildings that are found in eastern Greece and the eastern Aegean, such as the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, with its forest of columns, which resembles the Hippo-style halls of Egypt. But as for all other things, the Greeks tended to transform the ideas that they gained.
The question of influence of Egypt on Greece in the ancient world is one that really can't be denied. There were certain aspects of the Egyptian cultural record which served as catalysts that enabled the Greeks to borrow, transform, and move on. So I would not, no one is really denying that the two nations were in contact, that the two cultures did talk to one another. But there are major, major differences in the way the Greeks adapted the Egyptian legacy. So to think, as some people have said, that Greece is really an offshoot or the child of Egypt is absolutely missing the point. The Greeks borrowed from Egypt, as they did from other civilizations, not only Egypt, turned it into something completely their own and went off in a direction. So, for example, if you look
Robert Bianchi, an Egyptologist with the Metropolitan Museum of New York, has joined a growing list of scholars who disagree with Bernal. He sees striking differences between the two cultures.
Something that the Egyptians never dreamed of doing, never wanted to do. So, yeah, we have columns and architraves in both cultures, but the Greeks one have optical refinements that conform to their world outlook, and these do not appear in the Egyptian record.
The Great Pyramids of Giza are the most durable relics of the ancient world. The final resting place of the pharaohs, they testify to a fundamental tenet of the Egyptian faith, belief in the afterlife. To ensure the survival of the Ka, or spirit, the body first had to be preserved or mummified. Then, provisioned with food and surrounded by cherished possessions, the soul could depart for eternity.
The Greek mythology of life after death was remarkably similar to that of Egypt. The key shift is crossing a river by a ferry, which is a very Egyptian image for the way in which the dead travel. There was also the field of reeds, where the upper-class Egyptians lived in blissful happiness after their death, and this is very similar to Elysian, or the Champs-Élysées you have in France, these happy fields where you live. Then you have the word for the occupants of this territory, which is the same in Egyptian and Greek, Makarios in Greek, Macharu in Egyptian. So you have a number of striking similarities.
We have to understand that the Greeks, because they were using letters and words, were able to evolve an atomic theory. They were able to deal with invisibility. They were able to deal with how the universe was composed, what matter was all about. And that's a major, major difference. The Egyptians never speculated in that kind of rarefied way. This also holds true in areas of religion. Whereas, for example, the Egyptians believed that the body had to be intact in order to be reborn. The Greeks, on the other hand, would allow the bodies to be cremated. This is a heresy to the Egyptians because the body was now destroyed.
But it's interesting to note this may not reflect deep cultural differences, because in the United States today, people use mummification, whereas in Western Europe, they use cremation. You have this, this total difference in approach to the dead, which may reflect something about American society's materialism as opposed to Europe, but there's not much in it, and yet you have this fundamental difference in disposal of the dead.
Of the pharaohs attest to their mortality, but to the ancients, they were gods. Absolute monarchs, they controlled the affairs of everyday life as well as the destiny of Egypt. In the conduct of politics, there was no room for the common man.
But imagine trying to maintain control in a land like Greece that's so broken up by mountains and sea. It's just simply not possible, and as a consequence, Greek civilization developed in a very different way, with local places gaining power on their own, and they never got together to create a federal state such as you find in Egypt, nor a great monarchy such as is found in Egypt or Persia or elsewhere in the ancient world.
And as a result, there was more individual freedom, more individual expression. The individual, as we know it today, as a concept, really is born in Greece, not in Egypt. Someone, myself included, I guess, would be really out of place in Egypt in a nonconformist kind of way with the way one dresses or has clothes or a hairstyle. But this is something that would be perfectly adequate in Greece, where they stress the individual above a tyrant or a ruler in that sense.
Even in the Egyptian art, there was no freedom of expression. These paintings, breathtaking though they are, were not created. They were executed according to the dictates of the pharaohs. Artists painted what they were told, not what they saw. Highly stylized Egyptian figures appeared lifeless and two-dimensional, while the Greeks were beginning to explore the beauty of the human form.
The Greeks already begin to explore the body beautiful. The Greeks begin to be more naturalistic, more anatomically accurate, rather than stiff and rigid. And these two differences are also reflective of the differences in culture. Egypt was always a totalitarian regime ruled by a pharaoh. Greece was a democracy in which human beings and human thought counted. And when you look at an Egyptian statue and a Greek statue, you see that the rigidity of the Egyptian statue is the rigidity of a totalitarian regime. The naturalism of a Greek statue is a manifestation of the democratic principles that we know the Greeks formulated.
By 500 BC, the reign of the pharaohs had come to an end. Did the human spirit rise from the ashes of a dying civilization? Or did the Greeks invent themselves?
Greek is an Indo-European language, and therefore there must have been major influences from the north to make it one. On the other hand, there are an extraordinary number of elements of Greek language and other aspects of Greek civilization that are not Indo-European, and I believe these can be very plausibly explained as coming from Egyptian or Semitic.
The undeniable fact is, of course, that Egypt did play a role in the formative development of Iron Age Greece. That is to say that Egypt and its cultural traditions formed a catalyst whereby the Greek achievement was able maybe to get a spark and then develop. But what we have to understand is they are fundamentally different civilizations. Let me give you a case.
Backed by the archaeological record, most modern-day scholars agree with Robert Bianchi. Now it remains for Martin Bernal to prove his case.
My fundamental claim is not that Greece is a reflection of Egypt and the Levant. Clearly, it's a very different and independent culture. On the other hand, I believe it's impossible to understand Greece without seeing the depth of Egyptian and Semitic influences upon it. And this is what classicists have tried to avoid. They've tried to minimize something that I believe is absolutely central to the formation of Greek civilization.
Unfortunately, underlying the debate is the highly charged issue of race. Were the Egyptians black, as Bernal implies in Black Athena? Was Cleopatra black?
Was Cleopatra black? No, she was olive-skinned. She was a Greek. She was the Queen of Egypt, and her family had ruled Egypt for 300 years. But we know she was a Greek because the family was incestuous for 300 years. And so we're pretty sure about her bloodlines. Interestingly, the Romans tried to make her appear to be an Egyptian, but there's no question that she was in fact a Greek, and therefore the idea of her being black is not on.
The Egyptians regularly depict themselves in fairly light skin tones, and though it was surely a mixed population as generally recognized, I doubt that the term black is appropriate.
The word black is now used in a very wide sense to cover a whole lot of people who are only of mixed African descent. And certainly the Egyptians, if they were to go to Mississippi or had been to Mississippi in the 1950s, if they had wanted a cup of coffee, they would certainly have been refused.
We are living in a world in which people are beginning to understand the value of non-European cultures, the contribution that women are making in the world. And if we're going to become picky and start to argue and nitpick about he's black, he's white, he's this and that, we are losing the entire focus of the humanities. And we will quibble today instead of being able to live in a more enlightened society that recognizes individual difference for what it is, but preserves and bequeaths to our children and our children's children those characteristics of civilization that we deem worthy of preserving.
The debate over what role Egypt played in the rise of Greece has raised an incendiary question. Was Egypt black? Does it matter? It matters deeply to many African Americans searching for role models in the ancient world. Scholars, however, insist that such a notion represents a serious misreading of the archaeological record. The evidence tells us that the Egyptians were a multicultural people. Indeed, it may have been the varied tapestry of their society that allowed them to achieve so much.
Recent discoveries, just a few steps from the Great Pyramid at Giza, reveal the secrets of the people who really built these breathtaking structures.
This is the first time that we know something about the common people, the ordinary Egyptians who built the pyramid.
Though less powerful, they too bequeathed a legacy, not of gold, but written on stone.
I think this kind of document is particularly interesting because it is a document of the ordinary people of ancient Egypt.
Egyptology is changing as it starts to turn its attention to the people who physically built the national monuments of ancient Egypt, the workers. The River Nile. At 4,132 miles, the Nile is the longest river.
When the geography of southern Egypt is almost universally composed of a Nile, the cultivated strips on either side, and the desert rising on either side of that, it would have shaped your whole existence.
The river is fed from 1,400 miles south. Lake Tana in the highlands of Ethiopia is one of the sources of the River Nile. Every year, the rainy season comes between June and September. The continuous rainfall completely transforms the Nile. as the rushing water scrapes away the surface of the land. The muddy current flowed downstream, north through Ethiopia and the Sudan, until it reached Egypt, about 1 month after the rains. As a result, each July, the level of the Nile rose in ancient Egypt, and there was an annual inundation of water for 4 months of the year.
The inundation of the Nile is what determines the success of agriculture. The floodplain of the Nile
in the world. It holds the key to the success of this ancient civilization. It flows northward through Africa, through Egypt, and finally into the Mediterranean Sea. In a dry climate, ancient Egypt could have remained as barren as the deserts that surround it. Instead, from the 4th millennium BC, Egypt flourished, and the water of the Nile was its lifeblood.
If there were no Nile, Egypt wouldn't exist because it's in a completely arid region. So the only source of prosperity in Egypt is the Nile.
Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt, no division between rich and poor, and no pyramids. Before Egyptian civilization developed, there was no social hierarchy. The population was made up of farmers who lived off what they could grow on the fertile land around the river.
The Nile would have shaped the worldview of the Egyptians in a manner that's almost incomprehensible to us.
Is a shape that we don't necessarily think of, in which the river is at a slightly higher level than the ground around it. So when the river is very full, the water floods onto the surrounding land. The river then retreats and leaves the land wet and usable for crops.
In the 4th millennium BC, just before the Egyptian civilization developed, the population of Egypt was entirely self-sufficient and based on farming. During the 4 months of the flood, the farmers who made up Egypt's population were unable to work. They could only wait for the floods to subside. It was only once the water subsided that the land was fertile. Then, early Egyptian farmers were able to produce a rich harvest. But some farmers were more successful than others. This led to a new phenomenon. For the first time, there were rich and there were poor. Surplus food was the trigger that led to the development of civilization.
The creation of inequality is the essential change that brings civilization.
It flourished for 3,000 years. It left behind arguably the most spectacular remains of the ancient world. It was a land ruled by elite leaders, pharaohs. They built immense tombs, many of which still stand today. Their mummified bodies and ornate death masks serve as a reminder of their riches. This is the familiar story of ancient Egypt. But the rich and powerful were a tiny percentage of the population.